Good evening. It's my pleasure to be here today to bring to you my recommended 2019 budget. Our agenda for today is we'll start with my sharing a little bit about our past, our present, and our future. We'll talk about why we've titled this year's budget At a Crossroads, giving you an overview of school funding in Maine and the impact of our valuation on our local responsibility as a community. We'll go into some pretty deep detail about our my proposal to you, revenues, expenditures, and then the tax rate that is needed to meet that budget. And then we will do a wrap-up and next steps. So as we begin, great things are happening in the Portland Public Schools. But I'm here because I believe that we are at a crossroads for the district. The budget that I'm presenting today represents a significant increase in spending and in the tax levy that's needed to maintain our school system, to make it better, and to fulfill our Portland promise. I recognize that the sacrifice that this implies for many in our community, and I don't take that lightly. I've been honored to serve as the superintendent of the Portland Public Schools for the past year and a half. From my very first experience in this community, I've been struck by how central our schools are and the commitment of this community's, and how strong the commitment of this community is to quality schools in Portland. I've been humbled time and again to see that for over 200 years, Portlanders have prioritized support for schools. In my time here, I've tried to lead in a principled way. I've told the truth and represented to the best of my ability the values and ideals of this community. While I've been here a short time, I have embraced this community for what it represents, and nothing represents how I think of Portland more than its commitment to education. As many of you have heard from me before, the value of education was instilled in me from very early in my life by my family. For us, education became the pathway to success in this country. Without that pathway, I wouldn't be here today. So my passion for education is rooted in the fundamental belief that education is essential to one's success, to a thriving community, and to a strong and engaged citizenry. Those same principles and commitments are what we're talking about here today. The reason we are at a crossroad is because sustaining the quality of our schools in the current budget climate requires a fundamental reckoning with that centuries-old commitment to education. As you will see, the state is telling us that we have the resources that we need to support our schools. The state is redirecting funding to other school districts that they believe do not have the same level of resources to support their schools. And absent a major change in the way that schools are funded or a mass infusion of state funding for public education, the state is telling us we are on our own. I believe it's my job to advocate for our schools. It's my job to engage our stakeholders in this conversation about how much are we willing to spend on education as a community. It is my job to make the case that a great city requires great public schools. Over the course of my presentation tonight, I will try to make that case that our schools are thriving and that they are worth every dime that we spend on them. I will try to make the case that our schools are getting better and that our future is bright. I will try to make the case that the sacrifice that we are asking for is one that Portlanders have made before, for schools and for city services. I will make the case that over the past 10 years, the school district has been moderate in its requests from taxpayers. And finally, I will make the case that the investment that we are seeking is not out of proportion with what our neighboring communities spend on educating their youth. I recognize that in the end, the stakeholders of Portland will speak, and it's my sincere hope that my team and I will be able to make the case for your commitment, for your advocacy, and for your support. Our students, our family, and our staff deserve no less. So let's begin tonight by looking at what makes me so optimistic about our schools and presenting the case for the resources that we need to prepare and empower our students for the future. First of all, Portland Public Schools has been recognized by Niche as one of the top 10 school districts in the state of Maine this year. Recently, many of you saw this very well-publicized article in the New York Times that measures the effectiveness of school districts across the country. Sean Reardon, an economist at Stanford University, has a database which is referenced in some of the materials that you received in advance that ranks every school district in the country that has credible data for over a prolonged period of time, and it shows how districts stack up against each other in terms of student growth. This table here shows you how we're doing in Portland. I think it is a reason to be proud of this district. I want to point out that we are one of the top districts in the state of Maine, so you can see where we are, and you can see which districts are ahead of us. And then we've selected from the school districts that we often use as our benchmarks, and that you will see referenced later in this presentation also as how we compare to those districts. I think it's important to note the lead of this story, which is that our students make a little bit more than 5.5 years of growth for 5 years of time in the Portland Public Schools. That puts us in the 91st percentile in the country, and I think it's also important to point out that if you look at all of the districts that are ahead of us in the state of Maine, they all have a median income for their population that is substantially higher in most cases than our own. So I think that that is a credit to the work that is happening today in the Portland Public Schools. And you've seen some of the slides that I'm going to share with you before, but I think it's worth repeating that when you look at our not economically disadvantaged students, so our middle class students, our school district does a tremendous job, one that comparing to many of the school districts that, again, we saw in the previous slide and that we use as our benchmarks, surrounding communities as well as other urban communities across the state of Maine, our students who are not economically disadvantaged do very well. This here is our performance in high school reading and writing. This is our third grade reading. And this is our 8th grade math. So in all of those areas which we've picked out to represent the entire continuum of the educational experience, our students do extremely well when compared to like peers in other communities. Many of you were with us a month ago when we kicked off Parent U with a visit from Professor Amy Stewart-Wells from Columbia University. Dr. Stewart-Wells spent the better part of the afternoon sharing with us some of the research from some of her own research into the value of diversity in the education of students. And there are many different values from that. And I wanted to highlight a few of the things that result from that, which include improved cognitive skills, things like critical thinking and problem solving, increased intercultural knowledge, decrease in implicit bias, increase democratic outcomes, something that we've witnessed today and we will be witnessing again on March 14th when our students speak out in favor of school safety and gun control, engagement in participation in the democratic process, and better participation in employment. Universities across the country have recognized the value of this diversity. They are extremely selective in the way that they go about building their student bodies, and in many cases their staff, to provide for that diversity. And I will say to you that there are very, very few places in Maine where this is not just an aspiration, but is actually a reality, and that is the reality for all of our students in all of our schools. We also are unique in Maine, in addition to for our diversity, for the fact that we are able to provide our students with choice. Every year, our high school students our incoming freshmen are faced with the opportunity to select from 3 outstanding high school opportunities. That is something that we are the only place in the state of Maine that is able to offer that. And that is something that, again, as we talk about being prepared and empowered for the future, an important part of that is understanding how you go about making these seminal choices in your life, and our students are given that opportunity as freshmen. Many other communities across the state don't have that option, and they find their choice by choosing non-public schools, by choosing charter schools, or by opting to move to a different community. And our community has unique opportunities for students that you find nowhere else in the state of Maine. Again, our students travel to school every day using public transportation. Many of us probably did not have an opportunity to actually board a bus and understand bus schedules and how to get around a city until we were much older than our students are. And because of where we are, because of the choices that we've made along the way as a community, our students get to experience that as early as freshmen in high school. We also have tremendous opportunities in this community that are not available in other places in Maine. We have a vibrant arts community. Our students are able to participate in activities sponsored by our culture club partners, whether it's Portland Ovations, whether it's the Portland Symphony, whether it's the Museum of Art, or whether it's Portland Stage. Our students have the opportunity to participate annually in activities that teach them about the arts and make them patron of these fantastic institutions that are part of our community. We also, because of all of our partnerships, have access to a tremendous volume of volunteers and mentors that help our students to learn from people that are doing work, to have relationships with adults that are in the workforce and are successful in their lives. It helps them to create those pathways to their future by seeing and establishing those relationships. And I think, as I said, I want to make the case that our district is on the move, that the future is bright. This fall, the community of Portland once again ratified its commitment to public schools by overwhelmingly supporting our buildings for our future referendum. With this referendum, we will be in a position to bring all of our mainland schools up to 21st century learning standards, and I believe will make us more attractive to families moving into the region as they see brand new refurbished schools that are competitive with schools in our surrounding communities. Through the vision of this board and through the vision of the Portland Education Foundation leadership, many of whom are here with us today, the Portland Public Schools established a strong foundation a few years back. And the Portland Education Foundation has taken the lead in really beginning to build the district's relationship, the district's access to philanthropic giving from businesses and philanthropies in the Portland region. Under Kate Snyder's leadership, we are reaching out to an increasing number of community partners and trying to figure out what their needs are and trying to figure out how they can continue to make the Portland Public Schools into the thriving school system that it is. We also have made a strong investment in adult education over the years. Over 4,000 students participate in activities through our Portland adult education programs every year. These programs are vital to the pathway for so many of our families to make it into the mainstream. They access lifelong learning through Portland adult education. They learn the skills that they need to be able to be marketable and to be able to move themselves, and with them, our children, who are the children of many of our stakeholders in Portland adult education, into the mainstream. The board in 2010 took steps to begin to move us towards universal pre-kindergarten, and as you know from the recent presentation that we did, we are poised and ready to have a plan for you in the fall for getting towards the vision that you formulated in 2010 of creating universal pre-kindergarten for this community. So that is, again, part of what we're doing as a school district that makes me very, very hopeful for the future. You saw some of my data earlier that shows how we do a great job with our non-economically disadvantaged students. Unfortunately, as you know, and not unlike many communities around us or communities across the state or nation, we have a tremendous achievement and opportunity gap. And I'm incredibly proud of the fact that this board embraced the goals in our comprehensive plan in the Portland Promise a year ago that speak clearly and directly about this achievement gap and our commitment to lower the achievement gap. Just like you saw the slides before that show how our students compare very favorably to our benchmark districts, you have here examples of, this is 4th grade math, and I specifically picked a lower grade because I wanted to make the link to early childhood. We know that the sooner we can get our students into school and the sooner that we can provide them with the support that they need so that they can be successful in school, the more likely we are to succeed. And you can see that when it comes to our economically disadvantaged students, and the same is true for our students who are special education students, students who are learning English as a second language, our performance does not compare, even when, again, we're looking at apples to apples. So this is comparison to similar students, economically disadvantaged students, in some of our benchmark districts. So that's why I feel that we are at a key point, a decision point, and that is the crossroads that I believe we are at. Do we continue to support great schools and invest in making them even better, or do we allow the degradation, the erosion, the weakening of the school system by failing to sustain the investment that's needed to maintain our quality schools? And so now I'm going to ask Alicia Gardner, our Executive Director for Finance and Budget, to talk in detail about our budget proposal, and I'll be back to talk a little bit about some of the investments, new investments that we're proposing to make, and wrap up the presentation. So, Alicia.
So, thank you, Superintendent Batana. As our single largest non-property tax revenue, we felt it was important to discuss how the state determines funding on an annual basis for our school and all other schools. When the state considers the minimum baseline funding for each district, they consider factors such as the number of students and the number of staff, including teachers, principals, and support staff, which helps the state calculate a per pupil rate at the K-8 level and the 9-12 level. The state then uses these per pupil figures and gives an additional weight for limited English proficiency students, economically disadvantaged students, and pre-K and kindergarten students for a total amount. Additionally, the state gives us credit for special education funding, gifted and talented funding, transportation, a debt service allocation, and most recently, funding for our CTE centers and for regionalization efforts. This total allocation equals the minimum baseline education budget for the Portland Public Schools. So that's our first box there. The second box, the state then subtracts the amount of that baseline education, and they consider what is the responsibility of the city or town. And for this, they use the valuation of that town over a 2-year period. And we'll talk about how that's different than in prior years. The difference between this minimum baseline education and the total local responsibility is the amount that the state contributes to Portland Public Schools for education. The number of students and the town's valuation are 2 key factors that have the most weight in determining the amount of education funding that each town or city will receive from the state. So this table shows how our FY2019 allocation is broken down, and it includes the percent increase or decrease over FY2018. So that first line with $62 million is an increase of 4% over the prior year, and that's the total of all the changes with the teacher ratios and the number of students that we just talked about. We then add all of the other allocations, so gifted and talented, CTE, special education, and so on. And as you can see here, the largest changes for us were in CTE funding and debt reimbursement for this year. Our CTE funding went up about 208%, and our debt reimbursement went up 75%. All in all, we see an increase of $6.9 million over last year, which is an increase of 8.65%. And just to be clear, this $87 million is the minimum that the state requires the city of Portland to spend on education. The way that the state determines funding is based on our valuation, and for us it's called something called the state equalized valuation. This figure is calculated by the State of Maine Assessor's Office on an annual basis, and our FY2019 assessment is based on the average of our 2016 and 2017 valuation years. This year, it's approximately $8.25 billion, an increase of 6.42% over the valuation used for our FY 2018 assessment. The mill rate, which we're going to talk about in a few slides, is $8.51, and that's an increase of just under 4%. This number represents the total amount per $1,000 of assessed valuation the state expects municipalities to raise in support of the local school district. So in total, our local expectation for FY 2019 is just over $70 million, an increase of $6.7 million and almost 11% over FY 2018. It's important to note that out of the $6.9 million in new allocation that we discussed on the previous slide, the Department of Education expects that Portland will pick up $6.7 million of that increase, or 96.9%. So something that surprised a lot of people is that Portland Public Schools is not receiving significantly more money, when initial estimates saw us receiving many millions of dollars more. One reason that we did not receive significantly more funding is that the cost of education, as calculated by the funding formula, is higher than what was appropriated in the budget. So the state legislature added $76 million new dollars into the formula, and many of us heard about that through the state budget process last year. In order to fund the new formula, the new changes to this formula increase the cost of education by $158 million. So this includes going from 97% of EPS to 100% of EPS. This increased the value of special education across the board, so most districts saw their special education allocation go up. And teacher ratios for kindergarten students actually went down. So the state said, instead of having 17 students to a class, you should have 15 students to a class. So we got more credit for our teachers. So the difference between these two numbers is $82 million. So that's the shortfall that needed to be made up locally. So the mill rate last year was 819 and it rose to 851. There's one other thing that we felt needed to be clarified, and that is that 100% of the CTE in the funding formula is not new. This was not part of the budget process, but has been long discussed. In the past, there were many amendments at the state legislature to push this off into future years, and unfortunately, they did not vote to push this off again, so this got wrapped into a lot of the other changes that were happening during the year. So while the total allocation went up, and that was certainly beneficial to Portland, seeing as it went up by $7 million, there was one change in the formula that significantly impacted our subsidy. So going back 3 years, the Department of Education added a third year to the state equalized valuation to help places with the high and lows even out over the course of 3 years. For this year, that third year was dropped, and our 2016 and 2017 values were significantly higher than 2015. So for us, if we were to use the 3-year average, it would have been approximately $8 billion. As we discussed, the 2-year average was 8.25. So overall, this is an increase of $180 million that we are subject to this year that we wouldn't have been subject to had we used the formula that was used last year. And just to put that in perspective, when we take that new valuation and add it to the mill rate that we're looking at this year, that's $1.5 million that we're not seeing in subsidy that we would have seen had they used 2015 in that year. So our increase in the state valuation would have looked like 1.7 million as opposed to the 200,000 we're going to talk about in a few slides. So the other thing that was a little bit of a surprise to people is that the mill rate went up. And again, the mill rate is the amount that the state tells you that you have to raise $8.51 per every $1,000 of value you have in your community. So the mill rate has an indirect relationship with valuation. So if there's a higher valuation multiplied by a lower mill rate, that's the same as having a lower valuation times a higher mill rate. So for us, we anticipated a drop in the mill rate because the factors that we knew, or we thought we knew were true, were that there was more money going into the formula, which meant that the state was getting closer to 55%, and then therefore the local responsibility would drop. And that overall, for the most part, all state values rose. So it wasn't just us that saw an increase in funding, it was most places, or an increase in valuation, it was most places saw an increase in valuation. So the more valuation, the lower the mill rate. However, as we just discussed, there was not enough money into the formula to cover the new increases in education. And Javier and I met with the DOE last week, and one thing that was brought up is they don't believe that this was made clear to the state legislature, that the changes to the formula were going to be more than the amount appropriated. So it actually had an adverse effect than they thought that it would. So, after reviewing our ED-279, which is the form that we received from the Department of Education explaining our state revenue, and providing feedback to the DOE about some data discrepancies, our total subsidy for next year will be approximately $200,000 higher than this year. We do realize that it may be confusing to some people how we can interpret this as a loss in funding. This chart shows our total non-property tax revenue sources for the general fund from FY2015 to FY2019. As you can see in prior years, there were 2 different types of CTE tuition and 3 types of EPS subsidy. So that includes subsidy for CTE schools, for debt reimbursement, and the remainder being allocated to pre-K through grade 12. So because the state is now funding 100% of CTE, we're no longer allowed to bill for tuition, and this is a revenue loss for us of almost $2 million in the upcoming budget. Therefore, we lose the blue and the red funding that we had in prior years. We're also receiving additional debt service funds, as this is the first year we will have Hall School debt payments in our budget. This is the purple funding that you see above. So this also shows up in our expenditure budget, so this should not be viewed as new revenue. This is a reimbursement for what you're going to see on the expenditure side. So both of these increases to CTE and to debt are baked into our subsidy number. So really what we are showing here is the green portion. This is what's left over to fund the rest of our budget. And as you can see, this amount is significantly reduced in the current year. So this slide just puts that into math. So we have our state contribution of $6.8 million, and we are going to further reduce that in our budget. So you'll see in our budget that our state budgeted contribution for subsidy is 16.3, and that's because we're reducing it by another $500,000 because we anticipate the state will withhold that from our subsidy because of some Maine Care billing that we do. So overall, in our budget, you're going to see that it's about $138,000 higher than last year. And then we're going to take into consideration the CTE tuition that we're not able to bill. So our total revenue picture is down about $1.8 million. And then when we include the hall debt service, again, that's a reimbursement that is not new money that we are able to use for pre-K through grade 12. That's a total loss in that green bar of $3.4 million over last year. So in summary, the changes to the ED 279, which is our state subsidy formula, the state expects Portland to pick up 96.85% of new spending. Our state required allocation increased $6.9 million and includes regular education, CTE, special ed, debt service, and regionalization funds. And our local contribution increased $6.7 million based on the $438 million of new value from the prior year. So the difference between the state equalized valuation used in FY18 and the state equalized valuation used in FY19 is $438 million. We increased our Maine Care revenue, which you'll see in our budget, but we also must increase our anticipated seed reduction. So you saw the increase there of $80,000. Portland can no longer bill for tuition to pass, a loss of $1.9 million. And in FY2019, we are showing a loss in funding of $3.4 million due to losses in other revenues and increases to our debt budget. So, the valuation in Portland is climbing, which is in large part why we will see our state education subsidy continue to drop. In the state's view, the city of Portland is able to take on a higher share of the total cost of education because they believe there is a higher capacity to pay for these services locally. This is not going to only be an issue for fiscal 19. We anticipate that we will lose between $4.5 and $7.5 million next year in FY20, and we will continue to lose in the future. The City of Portland has been a minimum receiver of education subsidy in the past, and in discussions with the Department of Education, should our valuation continue to grow in this manner, they anticipate that we will be a minimum receiver of state subsidy again in the future. For those of you that may not be familiar with this term, a minimum receiver is a school district whose valuation, multiplied by the mill rate set by the state, raises more than the total allocation calculated by the state. So for example, if that were the case for this year, our local responsibility would have been higher than $87 million based on our valuation. So now that we understand what's happening to some of our major non-tax revenues, we want to discuss what makes up our $113 million budget. As you can see here, salaries and benefits account for 79% of the total budget, and this is true across the country. Anywhere between 78 and 82% is typically the amount in public education that salaries and benefits makes up. We are a service industry. Debt service in our budget makes up 7% of our budget, and all other categories account for the final 14%. We will also be discussing what part of this budget represents new investments, of which there are approximately $1.4 million or 1.2% of the total budget. And to illustrate that, you can see the light blue sliver there at the very top. The larger pie chart shows visually the breakdown of the $113 million between new investments, salaries, benefits, debt service, contracted services, supplies, and other. And that blue category, as I just mentioned, are our new investments. And of those new investments, they represent salaries, benefits, lease payments, contracted services, and some other supplies. So first we're going to discuss salaries. Our salaries are up 4.5% over last year, and in the salary budget we include regular salaries, temp salaries and substitutes, overtime, and then stipends. So approximately 65% of our salary increase, or $1.9 million, is due to planned increases in contractual obligations for current positions that are in the FY2018 budget. The remainder, about $1 million, are due to changes in professional development. So of that stipends category, we do have additional teacher pay, so that's part of the professional development cost, bringing positions onto local due to an expiration in grant funding, and additions to content leadership that Superintendent Batana is going to talk to us about in a few minutes. So our benefits budget is up 12.4%, and this is larger than we've seen in the past. 91% of this increase is due to projected increases in health insurance. The majority of the remaining increases in retirement, which is directly correlated to the increase in salaries. Approximately $200,000 of the benefit increase is due to the increase in the stipends and positions that we talked about in the previous slide. And at this time, we anticipate that unemployment, workers' comp, and life insurance will remain fairly flat. As we discussed, our debt service budget is up 32% over last year, approximately $2 million, and this is due to our Hall School debt service. Year 1 is coming up in FY2019. As we discussed, this is a reimbursement from the state of Maine. And had we not had Hall debt service this year, our debt service would have gone down by approximately $172,000 over FY18. So we do have other things coming off the books. And finally, our category of other expenditures includes contracted services, supplies, equipment, and other miscellaneous, as categorized by the state. They really do call them other expenses. Here you can see that the total increase for this budget for our $15 million is only $465,000. And for the most part, these can be explained by 2 changes that we've made this year. So the first part is called the student allocation, and this is the amount of discretionary funding that each school gets based on the number of students they have reported on October 1st of every year. So we go back and forth on whether October 1st is a good number or not to use, but this is the one we're sticking with for now. So the total amount, or the last time this per student allocation was changed was in fiscal year 2012. That was 7 years ago. And interestingly, we decreased it from what it was before. So prior to 2012, it was $111 for middle school students and $116 for elementary students, and we reduced that to $100. And it was $131 for high school students, and we reduced it to $110. So this year in this budget, schools are getting $135 per elementary student, $150 per middle school student, and $165 per high school student. The reason for this is I met with each of our building principals and department leaders throughout the fall and asked for feedback on what they'd like to see for changes in the budget. And overwhelmingly, almost every school and department brought up this per student formula and the fact that it hadn't changed in a very long time. So we were glad to be able to make this significant impact in each school's discretionary budget for things like instructional supplies and books. Secondly, the remaining $200,000 of investment is from new leases for teacher devices and student devices. I know that those leases have come before you. Last year we funded the first year of this payment out of E-rate reimbursement funds, and FY19 is the first year that we'll see that lease payment hitting the books. I do want to note for the teacher devices that it's $65,000 worth of devices, and the state's picked up $42,000 of that. So we're getting new laptops for approximately 1/3 of the total cost, thanks to the Department of Education. And to finish up our presentation, Superintendent Batana is going to talk about what the impact will look like on the tax levy and wrap us up.
But before I do that, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the investments. You saw that small blue sliver in the pie chart that showed what it is that we are proposing to do. And so I want to be clear that these are all investments in areas that we believe, that I believe, are central to our ability to follow through on the commitments that we made in the Portland Promise. So among the investments that we are making and that you saw constitute that amount are the continuation of some of the investments that we began last year. So that includes moving Make It Happen to our salary structure, having it be an employee as opposed to an AmeriCorps core member. That gives us continuity in programming that we were never able to attain when it was somebody who was on a rotating basis as part of an AmeriCorps assignment. We created a mentoring coordinator position for Deering mentoring that brought the two high schools into parity in terms of having somebody who was dedicated to creating mentoring opportunities for students at Portland and Deering, so that position is continuing. We have talked here before about the Seal of Biliteracy. We expect to have 40 students, among them Tiana, who are going to sit for the Seal of Biliteracy test this year, and so that is an investment that we're proposing to continue. And as you saw last week when we had the presentation on our work around the whole student goal, we created the Newcomer Center to provide services to our students with limited and interrupted formal schooling, and at the middle school, an area where we knew there was a significant amount of pressure on the schools to be able to serve the needs of those particularly challenging students, and we created that at King last year, and so this allows us to continue that investment. We also are proposing some new investments. You heard from Alicia just now about the student-teacher laptops. So that's part of our additional investments as a district. In addition to that, you heard last week from our Director of Social Emotional Learning, Brian Kavanaugh, on the work that he's been engaged in. Brian's position was funded for 1 year under a grant to the district from ConnectEd through generous donation from the Gorman Foundation, and that was with an understanding that that position would continue in the local budget in future years. And so we're proposing to move Brian onto the district payroll. This is something that we've been forecasting for a long time, that Nellie Mae has been a very generous contributor to the quality of our high school efforts over the past few years. And one of the hallmarks of the work that has happened under the Nellie Mae is the establishment of our extended learning opportunity coordinator positions at both Portland and at Deering. And so Eric Moynihan and Pam Bessie, who are both here today, will, if this budget is approved, will be part of the Portland Public Schools payroll going forward instead of grant funded. We also have some costs that have traditionally been picked up by Nellie Mae to support the work that Casco Bay High School does around the expeditionary learning model, and also that Portland High School does in the way of stipends that support some of their pathways work and their 9th grade academy. So these are stipends for teacher leadership in those particular areas, and the budget includes the resources to be able to continue those efforts that have been a successful hallmark of the work that's happening at all 3 of our high schools as a result of the Nellie Mae grant. We are making a significant additional investment in our adult ed. There are a number of positions that are changing, that are being created at adult ed. Some of it is by attrition, with positions being converted, but there are a number of additional positions that we are putting at adult ed, as well as continuing to increase the hourly compensation for our many hourly employees at Portland Adult Ed. We are engaged, as you know, in significant work around transitioning to a standards-based system. Part of that is tied to the proficiency transition, and we have done, under Malia Nally's leadership with the support of all of our principals and teacher leaders, done a significant amount of work this year to formalize and begin to create coherence across the system between what is in your curriculum and what assessments you use and the long-term standards, goals, expectations for our students. So part of what we're proposing to do is to fund a 2-day institute for our teachers across the middle and high school this summer that will be school-based and will allow them the opportunity to work with their peers, with our leadership, to be able to plan and continue that progress towards the proficiency-based system. And you heard Kevin earlier talk about the importance of increasing our investment in mental health, and we have some increases in social work FTE that we're proposing at Longfellow to go from 2.5 days to 3 full days of social work support, and at Riverton to add a social work position, half of which would be funded with, we believe, reimbursement for Medicaid billing that we would be able to do. As you know, Riverton has a significant low incidence special education population that we are able to bill for, and so we believe that half of that social work increase would be offset by the Medicaid billing. And one of the things that I've talked to the board about before is the fact that as a school system that is committed to our academic goals of improving our student achievement, we have no content area leadership in pretty much any area. So this year, as you know, we've been able to increase some work in our mathematics area through the use of some of our grant funds to be able to hire coaches to work in our school system. And we're proposing to increase our teacher leadership, to create teacher leadership stipends and positions that will be freed up to work on content area leadership in English language arts and social studies and in science beginning next year. So that is the extent of the additional investments that we are building into the budget that you have in front of you today. So this is the tax levy that's required for us to be able to meet that budget. As you can see in the aggregate, it represents a 9.7% increase on the tax levy. That's broken out for our general fund, for adult ed, and for our food service costs. The impact of this tax levy increase on a $240,000 home, which is the benchmark that the city uses for these comparisons, is just under $20 a month. It's $238 for the year. This levy increase would add 99 cents to the school portion of the tax rate. As I said when I began, I want to make the case that this is not unprecedented. The Portland community has seen these types of increases before, and so I think it's important to contextualize our situation today with the settings in which those increases occurred before. You can see that back in 2008, the school system received an 8% tax levy increase. In 2009, the city had almost 7% levy increase as part of what they needed to be able to do their work. And more recently, in 2016, the city had a 7% tax levy increase, again, as part of what they needed to be able to do this work. So this is not an unprecedented request. I recognize that it is a significant request and that it is a challenge for our community, but I want to make the case that it is not unprecedented. I also want to contextualize it with some of our comparisons. You've seen us use these comparisons before as we were looking at how we do as a school system, both on the positive side with our non-economically disadvantaged students, as well as on the other side with our economically disadvantaged students. And so I think it's also important for you to understand that what we're asking for is not out of touch with what our surrounding communities are also investing in their in the education of their young people. So you see here, and this is sorted by the per pupil spending in our surrounding communities, and you can see that among those 6 school districts that are represented here, Portland has the second lowest per capita spending from any of those districts. And when you also look at the increases over the past 9 years, and this is to the promise that I made at the beginning, that I would try to make the case that as a school system, we've made fairly modest requests from the taxpayers in this community over the same period of time. You can see that, again, with those same 6 comparisons, those same 5 comparisons in ourselves, that we have the second lowest percentage increase in the overall budget in that same period of time. So you can see that that represents slightly between a 2% and a 3% average increase over that period of time. So I know you've seen this before, but I do think that nobody speaks to the work that has happened in this district and in this community better than our graduates. The 10 people that are featured in this video are 10 people that graduated from the Portland Public Schools as recently as last year and as far back as 1953. These are all people that are still here in this community, that are contributing every day with their work to make this a vibrant and productive community for all of us who are here today. And so before we wrap up, I just want to spend 1 minute letting them speak for the Portland Public Schools.
I had a chance to meet with Senator Mitchell here in Maine at one point, and one of his sayings is that no one should be guaranteed success, but everyone should have an equal chance to succeed. And I feel like that was the embodiment of what Portland Public Schools is all about.
Portland Public Schools taught me to believe in my ability to affect change. So now I can encourage others to believe in themselves. I hope they continue to attract awesome teachers that encourage learning the way that my teachers did, encourage a sense of space and place the way that my teachers did.
I believe in public education. I believe we have to make it better. We have to invest more in it. The experience I had as a kid from elementary school to junior high to high school, it shaped who I am today, 110%.
I feel really fortunate for some of the resources I was able to utilize while at Portland Public Schools, like the access to new computers or after-school programs that helped you focus on subjects or things that you were more interested in.
Portland Public Schools gave me the confidence to be an empowered leader in our community today. The teachers at Portland Public Schools have very much molded me into being what I believe is a very strong, confident female.
Portland Public Schools taught me to challenge the norm, so now I can forge a path that's my own. It was a very supportive community where I had a lot of adult mentors that I could turn to if I wasn't feeling I was challenged enough, and they were able to kind of see what I needed to do and what path I needed to take, even if it was different than what most people were doing.
I felt that I had a support system by some of the teachers that I've gotten close with, and they are responsible for encouraging me and pushing me to do my best, not just at school, but what's outside of school as well.
I realized that, I am good at something, and, it just made me feel better about myself, and it made me motivated to apply to college.
The Portland Public Schools taught me to be resilient, so I could be the person that I knew I could be. It's not what you learn, it's the milieu in which you learn it that makes you strong, and that strength and courage helps you to be successful.
Portland Public Schools taught me important life lessons, so now I can deal with adversity in my life.
Portland Public Schools has taught me to be confident in myself, so that now I can be a good role model for others.
Portland Public Schools taught me engagement, so now I can engage others in the community.
Portland Public Schools gave me the energy to pursue my passions.
Portland Public Schools taught me two fundamental things: aim high and never, ever give up.
Over my first 6 months in Portland, I was blessed to have the opportunity to work with our amazing staff and community to develop the Portland Promise. When the board endorsed that plan as our goals, that was one of the proudest moments of my professional career. We've made a commitment at that time to preserving and improving our schools, and I hope you know how important that promise is to me as the proud superintendent of the Portland Public Schools, and as a Portlander. I know that this promise matters to all of you as well. Know that I am committed to working with you to keep the promise that we made together to this community. The crossroads before us is one between being a city that people work and play in, but don't live in and don't send their children to school, and one that looks like the Portland that we have today. Many cities have faced this decision before us. Do we want to be Indianapolis or Detroit? Or do we want to be Portland, Oregon, or Oak Park, Illinois, two communities that I know intimately? Those are our choices. We have a tremendous amount of work ahead of us, and I look forward to working with you, the City Council, and ultimately Portland voters, to see through to a budget that is true to our commitments and that reflect the values of this community. So, thank you very much.